On April 20th, 2010, the Deepwater Horizon disaster changed the lives of millions living near the Gulf of Mexico, as well as the scientists who responded to the crisis. These are some of their stories, intimate portraits of research, innovation, discovery. Welcome. I'm Jim McNamee, editor of Dispatches from the Gulf, a series of documentaries, short videos, and podcasts. Today, I'd like to share with you a remarkable story that happened nearly 30 years ago. What makes it relevant today is its connection to how scientists evaluate the impact of the Deepwater Horizon Oil Spill on the ecosystems of the Gulf of Mexico. Our story begins in the picturesque fishing village of Cordova, Alaska. Surrounded by rugged mountains and the frigid waters of Prince William Sound, this is a place teeming with wildlife. Supported by a thriving herring fishery, not very long ago, Cordova was among the top 10 fishing ports in the United States. But all that was before disaster struck in 1989 and quickly became headline news.
It's being called the worst oil spill ever in Alaska. The supertanker Exxon Valdez, loaded with nearly 53 million gallons of oil, ran aground off the port of Valdez.
One of America's most magnificent waterways is blackened and befouled tonight by the biggest oil spill in American history.
An oil tanker smashed into a reef near Valdez, Alaska today, causing the worst oil spill since the Alaska pipeline opened 12 years ago.
About 11 million gallons of crude leaked from the Exxon Valdez oil tanker, devastating nearly everything in its path. Ultimately, 1,300 miles of coastline were impacted. Hundreds of thousands of birds and marine animals were killed. Billions of larval fish were lost. Among the few bright spots was the herring fishery. Everyone thought Cordova was spared. And in fact, the fishery did reasonably well for the next 4 years. But then, something totally unexpected happened. And once again, Cordova was in the news.
The fishing village of Cordova was hard hit. A mainstay of the local economy, the herring catch, disappeared.
Fishermen from Cordova, Alaska say that lingering effects from the oil spill have caused a sharp decline in herring.
Not only did the herring catch sharply decline, nearly 3 decades later, it still hasn't recovered. For oceanographers studying the impact of the Deepwater Horizon disaster on the fisheries of the Gulf of Mexico, the collapse of Cordova's herring fishery serves as an important lesson from the past. Dr. Frank Hernandez is at the Gulf Coast Research Laboratory.
That's something we would call the latent effect. There wasn't any evidence of a potential disaster right immediately, but in the years that followed the spill, it became evident that there were some impacts.
Dr. Steve Murawski is at the University of South Florida.
We need to be cognizant that sometimes these events take a while to work their way through the ecosystem. Many of these animals are long-lived. It takes a number of years for baby fish to recruit to the spawning populations.
Dr. David Hollander is also at the University of South Florida.
Larval fish are much more susceptible to contaminant chemistry and contaminant exposure than are adults. Subsequently, if larval fish and even juvenile fish are more severely impacted by contaminant exposure, then as they become adults, those populations suffer dramatically.
So why should we care about an 11 million gallon oil leak that happened in Alaska almost 30 years ago, when today, the Gulf Coast states are still coping with the aftermath of a more recent 200 million gallon oil leak?
I think the biggest issue that we have in terms of learning from Exxon Valdez is to expect the unexpected. For example, in the years that we've been sampling since the Deepwater Horizon event, we've seen relatively poor production of juvenile red snapper. Now, is that just natural vagaries of the stock? Is there something to this in terms of a response to potential for oil pollution? We don't know. What we can do is monitor those stocks and see if there's some kind of correlation. So we need to have a healthy skepticism about early declarations of no harm.
Perhaps one of the most important lessons from the past is simply this: there are no easy answers, no quick fixes. Today, thousands of scientists, oceanographers, chemists, engineers, biologists are all working together to develop newer and better ways to understand and ease the impact of oil spills. To learn more about their work, visit our webpage at dispatchesfromthegulf.com. Funding for this podcast was provided by a grant by the Gulf of Mexico Research Initiative. And thanks for listening.